1,000 books, songs, plays, articles, and movies have been written about the 1925 Scopes evolution trial. But history comes alive when you walk into the courtroom in Dayton, Tennessee. You can almost hear William Jennings Bryan and Clarence Darrow argue about creation and evolution, and so much more. Visit the Scopes Trial Museum, and each July see the trial reenacted in the courtroom where it happened. For more information, check out the Scopes Festival website, scopesfestival.com.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Southern Festival of Books panel, Appalachian Voices, Past and Present. I would like to welcome you on behalf of Humanities Tennessee. If you're watching on Facebook Live or YouTube and would like to ask questions during this session, then you either need to download the festival app or visit our streaming site at www.humtennessee.org/SFB. As a reminder, Parnassus Books is our bookseller, and purchases of the books from our panelists via Parnassus help to keep the festival free. Humanities Tennessee staff will be placing the book buy links for this session at the top of our chat. The festival is a free nonprofit event that is supported in part by donations from individuals like you. If you appreciate this event and would like to support it as I do, you can do so by visiting our website at www.humtennessee.org. We will also post the link to the donate page. I would like to start out by thanking some of our key sponsors who help to ensure that the festival remains free for people like you and me. The first is the Metro Nashville Arts Commission, the Ingram Content Group, the Tennessee Arts Commission, Vanderbilt University, and of course our friends Parnassus Books. Please note that the festival inclusion policy applies online as well as in person. Anyone making inappropriate comments in the chat will be removed. Our staff will be watching for this and will take care of it for you. All right, I'm very excited for our panelists today. I think it's going to be a very lively conversation. I'm going to run through introductions first of each of our panelists, and then we will hear from them in short 15-minute intervals, and then there will be 15 minutes for all of you to ask any questions that you may have of them. The first panelist is Dr. Thomas G. Burton. He is a professor emeritus of English at East Tennessee State University. He has produced 3 documentaries on serpent handling and is the author of Serpent Handling Believers, The Serpent and the Spirit, Glenn Summerford's Story, and Beach Mountain Man, The Memoirs of Rhonda Lee Hicks. His most recent book, Voices Worth the Listening, 3 Women of Appalachia, is out now from Mercer University Press. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Thomas Burton. The next person that I would like to introduce is Sarah Smarsh. Sarah Smarsh is a Kansas-based journalist who has reported for the New York Times, The Guardian, and many other publications. Her first book, Heartland, a memoir of working hard and being broke in the richest country on earth, which is a very relatable title, let me tell you, was a finalist for the National Book Award. A 2018 research fellow at Harvard University's Shorenstein Center on Media, Politics, and Public Policy, Sarah Smarsh is a frequent speaker and commentator on economic inequality. Her most recent book, She Come By It Natural, Dolly Parton and the Women Who Lived Her Songs, is out now from Simon & Schuster. The last person that I would like to introduce is Wayne Winkler. Wayne Winkler is a descendant of Melungeons from Hancock County, Tennessee, very near where I'm from, and past president of the Melungeon Heritage Association. He is director of the public radio station WETS FM and lives in Johnson City, Tennessee. His most recent book, Beyond the Sunset, the Melungeon Outdoor Drama, 1969 to 1976, is out now. Please join me in welcoming all of our panelists. And I believe first up, we will hear from Dr. Burton.
Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure for me to be a part of the festival again this year, and the opportunity to introduce you to this book, Voices Worth the Listening, 3 Women of Appalachia, published by the University of Tennessee Press. This book, as the title suggests, is the presentation of the lives of 3 women of Appalachia. 2 are white women, 1 black. One important feature of this book is that the lives are told by the women themselves in their own voices from multiple interviews that I personally made with them. These interviews are blended and crafted from their free speech to form unified and progressive monologues. The monologues, however, attempt to retain the integrity of each person's speech and voice. They attempt also, as much as possible, to recreate in print the experience of personally talking or listening to these people. Certain details are altered, and that's in accordance with their wishes, so that they remain anonymous. In a way, these women are presented somewhat like characters in a play. Characters who speak directly to their audience in their own language without interruption and without detailed analytical interpretation. Analytical, scholarly interpretation of people or of regions can certainly be insightful and helpful. Yet on the other hand, they can overstate a single critical perception, or they can restrict at best other perspectives. A literary case in point is the statement by the remarkable old Vic actor and director Sir Laurence Olivier at the beginning of his film Hamlet. Olivier says, "This is the tragedy of a man who cannot make up his mind." The statement does provide dramatic focus for the film, but it is nevertheless a very restrictive commentary of one of the world's most complex dramatic persons. Hamlet is, of course, a great deal more than a man who cannot make up his mind. The same point of overemphasis and restriction is relative to critical analyses of Appalachians and of Appalachia. However, to repeat, this book, instead of being a critical analysis, is a presentation of the lives of these, or the voices of these women themselves. And you, the readers, have the opportunity to respond to them in your own emotional and intellectual insights. And as the title suggests, the voices of these women are certainly worth the listening. Furthermore, their voices are worth the listening for several reasons. If for no other reason, they are worth listening to because they are the voices of really interesting, very complex human beings whose lives have been lived off the beaten path. They are people whom you don't meet every day, or if you did meet them, you probably couldn't even guess the roads they have traveled. For me personally, when I heard the stories of the lives of these three women, I was really blown away. I could hardly believe what I was hearing, but they were true, nevertheless. They were forthright, deeply personal revelations of real people, real human beings, struggling with amazing endurance against tremendous odds. Certainly, some of those odds are of their own making. Some of them, however, are odds over which they have had little or no control. But unfortunately for them, in the language of Shakespeare, when sorrows come, they come not single spies, but in battalions. Let me list for you just some of the sea of troubles they collectively confront. For example, various criminal circumstances, which include homicide, insult, assault and battery, theft, rape, attempted murder, drug addiction felonies, and imprisonment. Domestic problems, parental dysfunction, childhood pregnancies, loss of child custody, and multiple dysfunctional intimate relationships, including physical and mental spousal abuse. Social problems, childhood bullying and racial discrimination and gender discrimination. Economic instability, either starting in poverty or ending in poverty. Homelessness, joblessness, and insufficient financial support by family, friends, and our government. Besides all these slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, they have to bear arms against personal demons as well. Low self-esteem, irresponsibility, naivete, bizarre sexual involvement, despondency, and despair, leading even to attempted suicide. It's almost incredible the whips and scorns these women bear, and with great fortitude. Certainly, these women are not unique in their struggles. In fact, they are in part representative of a whole category of women across Appalachia, as well as across America. A whole sector of women who, like them, struggle greatly in lives off the beaten path. As the cover design of this book attempts to image, they exist across Appalachia like a seam of rock that we've all seen as we've driven through a cut in a mountain pass. These women are in part representative, but they are not simply stereotypes, not of hillbillies, not of coal miners' daughters, not of unemployed workers on welfare. They are not simply stereotypes of any group of Southern Appalachians or stereotypes of any sector of Appalachia. And I would be quick to add that any attempt to definitively label types or to define the essence of any group or sector of Appalachia, as varied and as complex as they both are, is a fool's game. And in particular to this book, anyone attempting to define the essence of these women would be subject to a reproof by each woman in the sentiment of Hamlet: how unworthy a thing you make of me, you would pluck out the heart of my mystery. Even though these women are not simply stereotypes of Appalachians, they are part of the diversity of Appalachia. And to understand Appalachia, one needs to listen to the diverse individuals of Appalachia. And there's much music, much excellent voice in the people of Appalachia, and certainly in the voices of the women presented in this book. I would like now to take the opportunity to read an abstract from the first monologue, which is entitled "Some Would Call Her a Good Old Girl." I'm not perfect. No one is perfect. Everyone makes mistakes, and I did a lot of things. There were times I was forced by my husband to have relationships with women along with him and all that sort of thing. Sometimes we'd bring home men, would have to. It was for him, not me. It's not fun when you're forced to do it. I would go into the bathroom and cry. No one would believe the times I've ran out of the room just bawling my eyes out. I hated it. It was awful. I hated doing it because of diseases and stuff out there. I just thank the Lord that I never got anything. That scared me to death. I've kind of blocked out that part. I'd get so drunk. I would have to go get so drunk, plastered, to do that. So a lot of times I don't remember what happened or went on. But I was going to pretend. He just threatened me. If you don't do this, you're going to regret it when you get home. It just hurts to see someone you truly love make love with someone else. Why would they want to do that if they truly loved you? You should be happy in your marriage. You shouldn't be sad. But I was sad, very sad. And there were lots of things, sexual lives, that were just literally, it's almost disgusting to discuss or talk about some of the things. It turns your stomach. And he forced me to do other weird things, like he would hold me down and take razor blades and cut himself and cut myself, and we'd have to eat each other's blood. Yeah, it was crazy. And if I even brought up the thought of leaving him at that point, he threatened to kill himself. It was horrible. When you care and love with somebody, you just don't like doing that stuff. It turned him on, I guess. I don't think it was fun and games. It's just that was what he wanted. It's his sex drive or whatever, and that's what he enjoys doing. Later on, I came to find out when he was traveling on the road and I was sending him money to survive because he said they weren't making enough money to eat and stuff, that actually he was taking the money I was sending him for prostitutes, drugs, and whatever. And I was working 2 jobs. When you are in an abusive relationship, some people think you can just walk out of it, but you can't. You see these TV shows, and they say, if you're being abused or in neglect, call this number and we'll help you. It's just not that simple, especially if you love that person or if you care for that person and you want to be there and help them. It's really hard to walk away from somebody. It's also hard to explain. I'm a caring person, or I try to care. And you don't want to do anything to hurt a person you really care about. Even though they're hurting you, even if you give them leeway to straighten up, and they won't. It's hard. That was the situation during the open marriage for pretty much the rest of our being together. So off and on for 10 years of the 13 years married. But all that stuff wasn't constant. It was just every once in a while. Although I would have to say no a lot. And then he would get really mad. I just couldn't handle it. I'm just not that kind of person. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Burton. I really enjoyed hearing from you. Up next, we have Sarah Smarsh, and she's going to be sharing some of her work.
Hi, everyone. I'm so happy to be joining the Southern Book Festival. I wish that we were all in person. And on this particular panel, in case anybody's scratching their heads about why a journalist from Kansas is joining the discourse, I've written a book about certainly of one of the most famous voices of Appalachia, being Dolly Parton. And I'll get to that quickly. But first, I want to say that in case anyone joining read my first book, Heartland, which came out a couple of years ago, it's kind of a hybrid of memoir and social critique and a bit of U.S. history on socioeconomic class. You might remember my grandmother, Betty, who's sort of the star of the book. I'm in her house right now in this working class neighborhood of Wichita, and like right next door, some good Kansas homeowners are re-roofing their own house. So if you hear a nail gun going off, maybe appropriate for my presentation, since I tend to write about the working class and the working poor of this country. But my new book, She Come By It Natural, Dolly Parton and the Women Who Lived Her Songs, which is indeed from Simon & Schuster. The imprint specifically is Scribner, I wanted to mention, comes out officially on Tuesday. And I'm excited to tell you a little bit about it. I mentioned my first book, Heartland. That is in many ways obvious integration of the work that I've been doing as a journalist for a long time with my personal vantage as someone who grew up on a small wheat farm in southern Kansas. A book about Dolly Parton, you might pause and ask why, and why would this be the follow-up? So I think that the most important way that I can sort of introduce the text to you is to give you a little context as to why it exists. I'm certainly not a celebrity writer. I don't cover popular culture, so to speak. I do write about class and sometimes how it intersects with all other aspects of identity, including race, gender, and so on. And in 2016, you might remember that was an election year that had some repercussions in this country, and it was a quite contentious time, the sort of dawn of this very polarized political moment that we're experiencing. And, every headline that I saw about the place I come from, if you want to speak in general terms, my people, the rural white poor folks, basically, every headline was quite negative and quite bleak. It seemed to be about hate, bigotry, an aspect of that population or demographic that's certainly present. But I happened to know, as someone who's been very fortunate in my life as a first-generation college student who went on to study in the Ivy League and be fortunate to intersect with some pretty rarefied spaces, I knew firsthand that folks like that exist at every rung of the class ladder, among white folks specifically. And so those headlines kind of bugged me in a personal way, I guess. And I wrote a little bit of media criticism to that end as one of the few, folks with that particular lens within national media. Now, that same year, Dolly Parton had a new album out for the first time in many years, and was touring, putting on these huge arena shows for the first time in a very long time. And I could see how the energy coalescing around that. Well, first of all, all of a sudden, my friends, and I live in rural Kansas today and have spent most of my life in Kansas, but most of my industry is centered in New York, and I've got a lot of good friends there. I'm seeing them on Twitter, like tweeting about Dolly Parton. And I'm like, what do you know about Dolly Parton? I knew she was a huge icon. I didn't understand the extent to which, and maybe none of us did until recent years, the extent to which she's not just a creative genius and now an icon of popular culture, but also just an incredibly unifying figure in a very rare and notable way in a climate such as today. So I was kind of intrigued by this, and then I started thinking on it, and it occurred to me, that rural, specifically rural white poor place that I come from, there's all these headlines about the worst of it, and darned if Dolly Parton doesn't represent the best of it. And so that got me thinking. There's also got a lot going on that year about gender. We, of course, had Hillary Clinton as the Democratic presidential candidate, and there was a lot of misogyny in the air that year, regardless of your politics. I think that's an objective fact. And it occurred to me, this was right before like the dawn of the Me Too movement, and I was thinking, there's something about feminism right now that I feel like no one has articulated, at least in a mainstream way outside of academia. And that is what I would call working class feminism. And that's what I was raised on. That's what I was raised by. And what I mean by that is it's not theory. It's not exclusive in its language. It might not be even articulated or expressed in an overt way, but it is rather lived organically. And so it occurred to me, country music written by women that I was raised on was the formative feminist text of my life, if you will, that I was then bringing to the year 2016 and all the ways that year was offending me at its intersections of class and gender. I was working on Heartland at the time, my memoir that came out a couple years later, and so I was plenty busy. But a great magazine called No Depression, that if there are any country music fans out there, you might follow it. It's a longtime publication specifically about roots music. They had a new fellowship to allow a writer to write in depth about the way in which that genre talks to or influences society and culture in a broader way. I thought, oh boy, I want to write about how Dolly Parton relates to feminism. I got the gig, and so I was writing what ultimately became this book. Back at that moment several years ago, it was serialized in No Depression magazine as a print-only read. So probably a fairly small readership. And now we find ourselves in another election year, another fraught moment, no less a divisive moment, and certainly no less problematic moment in terms of class and gender. And happily now that text is now in book form. So I'm going to read you just a smidge from it. And I want to add, by the way, while I'm finding my place here, that I wasn't raised like as some sort of Dolly Parton super fan by any means. She was just I was a kid in the 80s. And, for anyone who was cognizant in that decade, she was just sort of woven into the fabric of popular culture. You'd see her on a talk show. Her music was on the radio. She was starring in blockbuster movies. She actually, I think, kind of appropriately enough, if I took up the mantle of attempting to do justice to her life and career in this book, starred in her first Hollywood role, 9 to 5. The year that I was born, 1980. So in some ways, this book is really a gesture of gratitude to the women of her generation, not least of whom being my grandmother, Betty, who I mentioned just a few minutes ago. I wrote about her struggles in Heartland. And I sort of assert in this book, into which is woven just a bit of memoir. I keep the focus off of myself for the most part, but wanted to provide some context as to why I get this in a particular way. And that context has everything to do with my grandma, who raised me and who was born just like 5 months apart from Dolly Parton. And I kind of put forth in the book that in some ways she and women like her are the real Dolly Parton, by which I mean the stories that she built her career on, which are very much about, hard knocks and specifically hard luck lives as women. Dolly Parton left her family's holler in East Tennessee at about age 18. So she's been rich and famous a lot longer than she was poor in near Pigeon Forge. But she has continued to tell the stories of the sort of women that raised me, and whom I believe, to whom we owe a debt of gratitude in a way that the feminist movement proper perhaps hasn't afforded. So this is in a section called Leaving Home. Parton's career took off at the same moment the women's liberation movement did, providing a revealing contrast between feminism as political concept and feminism embodied in the world. Like most women in poverty, Parton knew little of the former, but excelled at the latter. You won't get very far as a poor woman without believing you are equal to men. The result of that belief is unlikely to be a leaning in, possibly sound advice to middle and upper class women seeking to claim the spoils enjoyed by the men in their offices and homes. A poor woman's better solution is often to turn around and walk away from a hopelessly patriarchal situation that she cannot possibly mend with her limited cultural capital. And in the book, I tell, as evidence along those lines, the story of Dolly Parton's quite brave departure from the Porter Wagoner show when she was a young and relatively new star with a sort of fragile stake in popular culture in the early 70s. When Parton left Sevier County, Tennessee, it was 1964, a presidential election year. That's a recurring theme here, the interplay between figures like Dolly and our political realities. And the country was torn by political uprising and tragedy. Young men were returning from Vietnam in caskets, and President John F. Kennedy had been assassinated less than a year prior. In her 1994 autobiography, Dolly, Parton recalled hearing news of Kennedy's death over her boyfriend's car radio while en route to perform on the Kaz Walker radio show during a school break. Quote, "I had loved John Kennedy in the way one idealist recognizes another and loves him for that place within themselves that they share," she wrote. I didn't know a lot about politics, but I knew that a lot of things were wrong and unjust and that Kennedy wanted to change them. Her boyfriend, however, responded to the announcement by referring to Kennedy with a racist epithet, basically relating to his stances on people of color. She promptly dumped him. The women's liberation movement of the 60s and 70s hadn't yet reached fever pitch. Kennedy had created a commission on the status of women, but the National Organization for Women didn't yet exist. Strict conformist gender roles still trapped females of all socioeconomic classes as wives, mothers, and second-class citizens. When Parton stepped off the bus in Nashville, some of that movement's foundational texts were yet to be published, but they likely wouldn't have reached Parton anyhow. The women of her lot were too busy feeding hungry mouths, some further isolated from discourse in a pre-internet rural place, to read such literature, written in a form of English they didn't speak anyway. The reason I end up writing stuff like this, by the way, is what I tell folks sometimes when I give talks. I speak two versions of English, country and fancy. And country is my first tongue. And I think that Parton has quite intentionally stayed true to that voice, regardless of what space she's moving through, regardless of whether she's supposed to feel ashamed about it. And that's very strategic and intentional, and has worked out well for her, of course. Parton was living feminism without reading it. Leaving home alone as a woman with professional aspirations and no financial means demonstrated she wanted a better life and thought she deserved it, though no model existed for the journey ahead beyond her own imagination. Meanwhile, the place where she'd pursue that life, the recording capital of country music, couldn't have been a more harrowing gauntlet for a woman. Even if America had by then put a few small cracks in the ceiling that held women down, Nashville was squarely situated under the thickest glass. And I'll leave it there. Look forward to questions at the end.
Hi. Thank you so much, Sarah. So I wanted to remind everybody, Sarah Smarsh is the author of She Come By It Natural, Dolly Parton and the Women Who Lived Her Songs, out Tuesday from Scribner. We've already heard from Dr. Thomas Burton. He's the author of Voices Worth the Listening, 3 Women of Appalachia, out from University Press. And as our final speaker, we're going to hear from Wayne Winkler, who is the author of Beyond the Sunset, the Melungeon Outdoor Drama, 1969 to 1976, out now from Mercer University Press. As a little bit of a tidbit, Wayne and I are actually distantly related. I am a descendant of a Collins, so
All right.
we're cousins.
Well, good to have you here, cuz. I would like to thank you for having me here at the Southern Festival of Books. It's a real honor, and thank you very much for inviting me. People may be wondering who the Melungeons are. They're not the most well-known group of people in the world, but they are a group of mixed-race people who were first documented in the Northeast Tennessee, Southwest Virginia region about the beginning of the 19th century. And in the 1990s, as the internet became more widely accessible to ordinary people, the Melungeons underwent kind of a resurrection of interest, mainly through the work of Dr. Brent Kennedy, who wrote a book entitled The Melungeons, The Resurrection of a Proud People. And I was proud to be able to work with Dr. Kennedy. And unfortunately, Dr. Kennedy passed away about 3 weeks ago. So I kind of want to dedicate a bit of this to him. The reason the Melungeons really became well known is I think, the topic of the book, and it's what I wanted to write about because it wasn't a really well-known episode in history. It was a very brief run for this particular outdoor drama, just from 1969 to 1976, but it represented a lot, and only part of that was representing the Melungeons and their image to the world. A lot of it had to do with trying to make Hancock County a more viable place to live. And I would like to read just a little bit of the second chapter, which I think kind of sets up the situation pretty well. All Charlie Turner wanted was a road, not even a new road, just to fix up the one they had. Was that too much to ask? Charles Turner was the mayor of Sneedville, the county seat of Hancock County, and a tiny town wedged between the Clinch River and Newman's Ridge. Sneedville's central feature was the courthouse. It was surrounded by a low wall where men sat, rolled cigarettes, gossiped, and watched a little bit of traffic along Main Street. The other government buildings in Sneedville were the U.S. Post Office, a red brick building a couple of blocks east of the courthouse on Main Street, and the Hancock County Jail, a 100-year-old two-story wooden structure 1 block west and south of the courthouse on aptly named Jail Street. An elementary school and a high school were also within the town limits. Since taking office in 1961, Turner had been trying to get the state or the federal government or somebody to improve the road to Morristown. Morristown was only 23 miles from Sneedville, but the trip from Sneedville to Morristown was mostly along State Highway 31. Highway 31 ran between Sneedville and Mooresburg. At Mooresburg, you had to turn right to go west on US 11W. Then at Bean Station, a left turn led south on US 25E into Morristown. Morristown was where the jobs were. Most of the people in Hancock County who worked at a job, that is, made a living by means other than farming, held jobs in Morristown, working in one of the small factories, lumber yards, or in one of the other mostly blue-collar jobs to be found there. Morristown had just over 20,000 people, with another 19,000 or so living in surrounding Hamlin County. Only 874 people lived in Sneedville. There were only 6,719 people in all of Hancock County. Without Morristown, there would be practically no work for the people of Hancock County. The problem was the road. Highway 31 went over Clinch Mountain, which was technically a long ridge incorporating several summits. The people who drove Highway 31 every day knew every twist and turn of the road. In good weather, they had no problem negotiating the route, day or night. But a half-inch of snow changed the situation considerably. Snow didn't fall often in northeast Tennessee, but you could count on at least 3 or 4 good snows in the winter. And the mountain was high enough that snow stuck on the road near the top, even if it didn't stick down below. If the road became icy or even slick from heavy rains, Clinch Mountain was a forbidding obstacle to even the most experienced drivers. It could guarantee that the last few moments of your life would be exciting indeed. Because of Clinch Mountain and State Highway 31, employers in Morristown were reluctant to hire people from Sneedville or Hancock County. Oh, they were good workers, all right, good people. But if the weather turned bad, even just a little bit bad, most of those good people weren't going to risk the drive to show up at work. A good snow could keep them away from work for a week, maybe more, depending on when the state road crews finally got 31 clear enough to drive. It helped if you told a prospective employer that if you got the job, you were planning to move to Morristown. But it wasn't only jobs that drew people out of Hancock County. Living in Morristown meant you could shop for groceries in a real supermarket instead of one of the dozens of tiny country stores that served Hancock County. You could go to a movie once in a while, a current movie, not like the ones at the Sneedville Theater. You could take your wife to a nice restaurant, and your kids could go to a better school, one that could pay for better teachers and give your kids a better chance of learning a trade or even going to college. In Morristown, you could make a better life for yourself and your family. Charlie Turner was well acquainted with the desire to move somewhere with more opportunity. Years later, he would tell a reporter from up north, "My whole high school graduation class left, but I just said, I'll be darned if I'll do that. I'll just run for mayor and see what I can do." But when he was just starting out, he taught in a one-room schoolhouse on Newman's Ridge. Later, he opened a drugstore. He wasn't a pharmacist like most people who opened small-town drugstores, but he still did well. One bit of drugstore business Turner could handle was developing photographs. He was a skilled photographer and had won several awards. Eventually, he ran for mayor of Sneedville. Hancock County was almost totally Republican, but Charlie was a Democrat, and the only Democrat in his family. Still, he won the election, and the one after that, and the one after that. Charlie Turner stayed in Sneedville on his own terms and made it work, but he knew how unusual his decision was. There was a saying among former Hancock County residents, a lot of smart people come out of Hancock County, and the smarter they are, the quicker they come out of there. Most people as smart and ambitious as Charlie Turner got out of Hancock County sooner or later. The folks who left Hancock County for Morristown weren't really gone, not really. They were still connected. The ones who lived in Morristown or nearby referred to Hancock County as over home, as in, are you going over home this weekend? Mama and Daddy still lived there on the old family farm. Brothers and sisters, aunts and uncles, cousins and old friends, they were still over home, and you could be there for a visit in less than an hour most days. Some of those who moved to Morristown were still very involved in life over home. Some still attended the church where they'd gone to Sunday school and been baptized. Some were even involved in Hancock County government. The ties binding them to Hancock County might have stretched a little bit, but they weren't broken. But when folks moved to Morristown, they reduced the population and the tax base of the county and made it harder to provide services to the ones who remained. Many people moved farther away than Morristown. A whole colony of transplanted Hancock Countyans lived in or near Baltimore, drawn away during World War II by good-paying jobs at shipyards and defense plants. Even more had moved north to Indiana, Ohio, and Michigan, taking factory jobs with union paychecks, making more money than was possible even in Morristown. They still came home sometimes, most of them, maybe 2 or 3 times a year when the kids got a vacation from school. They'd load up the family car and head south down home. Interstate 75, the hillbilly highway, was slowly being built across Kentucky, and nearly every time these transplanted Hancock Countyans came home, a little more of the trip was made on a 4-lane divided road. The transplants were different after they'd been up north a while. They had different attitudes. Some of them had stopped going to church or were going to a different kind of church from the one they'd grown up in. They'd become more cosmopolitan, and the folks at home sometimes felt that the transplants looked down on them a little bit. Their kids had Midwestern accents, and they enthralled their country cousins with tales of life in the big city. And as time went on and the kids got older and busier, those families made the trip back home less often. Pretty soon they'd come back home only for funerals. They weren't part of the county anymore. They were gone. By 1969, Hancock County had fewer people than it had in 1869. The population had peaked in 1940. Census figures for that year showed 11,231 souls living in the county. The 1960 census counted only 7,757, a population loss of almost 31% in 20 years. Since 1960, Charlie guessed, at least 1,000 more had left the county. The birth rate couldn't keep up with the number of people leaving for better job opportunities elsewhere. As mayor of Sneedville, Charlie Turner had helped attract some new jobs to the county seat. The voters had almost unanimously approved a bond issue to develop an industrial park. Senator Albert Gore had helped the county land a $98,000 grant from the Federal Economic Development Administration to further develop the property. That would bring as many as 135 new jobs into the county. Eventually, improving Highway 31 was crucial. That road was a lifeline for Hancock County. If the road weren't so dangerous, people could commute to work in Morristown and remain in Hancock County. There were only really 4 ways in and out of Hancock County, well, 5 if you counted State Highway 66, but Highway 33 was the important one. None of these highways were as important to Sneedville and Hancock County as State Highway 31. And try as he might, Charlie Turner hadn't been able to get that road improved. But now he could see a chance. If no one would build a road for people going out of Sneedville, maybe they would build a road for people coming in. Like everyone else, Turner had his doubts about the idea of an outdoor drama. Still, those 2 professors from Carson Newman College had studied the county's economic situation and told county leaders that their best chance of economic development was tourism, and their best chance of developing tourism was with an outdoor drama. Outdoor dramas were popular and attracted tourists, even to small towns like Boone, North Carolina. They had been staging Horn in the West in Boone since 1952. It was the 3rd oldest outdoor drama in the nation. But Boone was a college town, home of Appalachian State University, and had a direct highway connection to Winston-Salem and Interstate I-40. Trail of the Lonesome Pine, performed in Big Stone Gap, 45 miles from Sneedville, was the longest-running outdoor drama in the Commonwealth of Virginia. Big Stone Gap was just off US 23, a major highway that ran from Jacksonville, Florida to Mackinac City, Michigan. Unto These Hills was staged in Cherokee, North Carolina, on the Qualla Boundary Indian Reservation on the eastern edge of the Great Smoky Mountains National Park, and the park drew millions of visitors each year. Sneedville wasn't close to anything, no major highways or tourist attractions. Turner and the other local leaders were counting on their outdoor drama to entice tourists across Clinch Mountain into a town that lacked any of the usual amenities for tourists, like restaurants or motels. Oh, sure, the Green Top Inn on Main Street in Sneedville served good food, very good food, as a matter of fact, but the exterior of the restaurant looked rough, and the interior wasn't much better. And the town motel, well, that was just 5 little rooms over the beauty parlor on Main Street. Up to now, that had been plenty. Not many folks came to Sneedville needing a motel room. But if the tourists came, the restaurants and motels might follow. That was the hope, anyway. Charlie Turner and the other leaders in Hancock County were counting on the subject of the play to attract tourists, but it was the subject of the play that had been so controversial. Melungeons weren't a topic people in Hancock County were used to talking about. Even the word Melungeon was not usually spoken in public, and no one in the county wanted to be identified as a Melungeon. Everyone had been upset when that Saturday Evening Post article came out. The Melungeons were Hancock County's dirty little secret. Times were changing, though, and people were starting to see Melungeons in a different light. Those articles by Louise Davis in the Nashville Tennessean hadn't been as negative as the Post article. Several other more or less positive articles had been published in various newspapers and magazines, and that new novel by Jessie Stewart, daughter of the legend, was very sympathetic to the Melungeons. People were curious about the Melungeons, and as the Reverend Connor had pointed out, if Hancock County didn't take advantage of that curiosity, some other place would, and would reap the benefits. If the Melungeons were Hancock County's best shot at attracting tourists, then the people of Sneedville were going to give it a try, even if hardly anyone in the county admitted to being a Melungeon. As Thursday, July 3rd, 1969 dawned in Sneedville, Charlie Turner had a lot of work to do. It was going to be an historic Independence Day weekend. For the first time, tourists were going to arrive in Sneedville, Tennessee. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Wayne Winkler. And as a reminder, Wayne Winkler is the author of Beyond the Sunset, the Melungeon Outdoor Drama, 1969 to 1976, out from Mercer University Press. All right, well, we have about 8 minutes left to answer any questions that you all may have for our panelists. So if you would like to, please join us in either the app or on our Facebook live stream or YouTube comments. One of our Southern Festival of Books staff members will be monitoring for any questions that you may have. I guess I will start us off while we're waiting for people to join us. All of you spoke a little bit about, and I wrote this down from Dr. Burton, what one of the women in his book said, it's really hard to walk away from a person. And I think that is kind of a conversation that we're having, especially in these rural places now, about walking away from people or places or economic opportunities. Infamously, Mr. J.D. Vance said in his book Hillbilly Elegy that these rural regions were experiencing brain drain. So could you talk a little bit about what your research or your writing has uncovered about people moving away from these communities?
Well, the person, if I may ask, go ahead.
I was going to say, I actually, about a year ago, wrote an opinion piece for the New York Times, the headline for which had included the phrase brain gain. So I think I might be equipped to comment on this briefly. There, in terms of quantitative measures about which direction the population is flowing in that proverbial rural-urban divide, which of course is not a dichotomy. It has many more shades than two, but numbers are starting to show that some of these communities that are sort of patly referred to as dying or dwindling are actually gaining in some interesting ways. A lot of it has to do with racial demographic shifts. Places like Western Kansas, where there's a robust industrial meatpacking industry, are seeing large increases specifically in the Hispanic and other immigrant populations. But even apart from race, I have seen a sort of trend of a return, if you will, Wendell Berry, the great Kentucky writer and thinker, referred to these folks as homecomers. Actually, I think that term was coined by a Kansan named Wes Jackson at a place called the Land Institute, who's a friend of Wendell's. But this is something that I feel like is only thus far at a kind of qualitative experience for those of us who live in rural areas, care about them, are resisting the narratives about, they're all ghost towns. I know people who could, if they chose, live in New York or other places, and they are choosing to specifically return to rural spaces that they used to live. They are highly formally educated. So I do think that there's something shifting in our culture about like what is and isn't cool. As far as what's tenable economically, that's another story, and it involves like getting broadband into those places and so on. But it might not surprise you all if you've read my writing to know that I disagree with J.D. Vance on most things.
I was going to address that situation. It does, your question in a way about moving out isn't as appropriate to the area that I was talking about, or these women were from, of Central Appalachia. They aren't a part of these central pockets of poverty. Now, one of the women is a black woman. Her life began in poverty. Uh, she started out when she was born. Her mother was living in various places, and one of them was with a friend. And finally, they got a place of their own, and it was infested with rats. And she thought it was horrible and hated it. Finally, they got into the project, and that was a good place for her because she had friends, a clean house, a clean room, and so forth. And she, whereas uh, instead of moving out someplace to find a better place, she started working as a very young person, as she worked in this every summer, for example, when she was in high school. Then as a senior high school, she worked even uh, from from 3 o'clock at night until 11 o'clock, and then went to school the next day and kept a 3.5 average. She's kind of a success story. She goes ahead and works, even though her boyfriend, who's become her husband, is a drug addict. For 14 years or so, she she gets a job. She thinks she'll go to a college, a business college. She got a degree in medical assistantship and worked there. Then she went from there to go to the university, got a university degree, and became a nurse. Then she's still working as a nurse and without, leaving. The first woman that I read from, she she was a hard worker, but she had problems of even transportation getting to work, and the situation was not good for her. She couldn't keep a job because she couldn't get to it, and she tried to get. She got her son to give her transportation and so forth. Finally, she did move out and went to Virginia Beach, I believe. So, I think this it's a different situation um, in the circumstances of the women I was talking about. This stratum of women who are living these lives that are very difficult, uh, out of the mainstream, but it's not within a poverty stricken place that they are trying to get away from.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Burton. We have about a minute left, so I would once again like to remind you guys that the link to purchase these books, Voices Worth Listening to, Three Women in Appalachia, Three Women of Appalachia, Voices Worth the Listening. She Come By It Natural, Dolly Parton and the Women Who Lived Her Songs. Thank you. And Beyond the Sunset, the Melungeon Outdoor Drama, the links to purchase those are in our chat. And as a reminder, please donate to Humanities Tennessee to allow this to remain a free event. Thank you all so much for joining me.
Thank you very
Thank
much.
you very much, Wendy.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.